Hi, welcome to A Gray Barn Rising. Thank you for joining us this evening to listen to poetry and to hear about the poetry of one of my very favorite poets, the Japanese poet Takahashi Shinkichi. Takahashi Shinkichi lived from 1901 to 1987. He was a marvelous poet, began as a Dadaist actually, and had a life-transforming experience. Well, I should probably back up and say that he had been in and out of trouble in his early years, had been thrown in jail for some petty crimes and things like that, and really fashioned himself as a Dadaist. He produced a mimeographed copy of his poems in 1921, and then in 1923, when he was 22 years old, he brought out his book, Poems of Dadaist Shinkichi. And the poems were very wild. He even wrote a great manifesto that's difficult to find, entitled Assertion as Dadaist. Right around this period after his book of poetry came out, he had what could be considered a breakdown, a nervous breakdown, and returned home. He had been in Tokyo. He returned home, and his parents kept him in a room. Some accounts say that it was locked, but they kept him in a room for 3 years while he healed and tried to recover from his breakdown. He emerged a new person. That's this life-transforming experience I alluded to earlier. He emerged a new person and began studying calligraphy after a while, and then got very involved in Zen teachings, and eventually became a Zen master as his life moved forward. What's particularly interesting to me about Takahashi, and by the way, I'm referring to him as Takahashi, I'm not calling him by his first name. In Japanese, the surname comes first, so his name is Takahashi Shinkichi, and so I'm going to be referring to him by his last name or his surname, which actually comes first in the Japanese language. What's fascinating to me about Takahashi is that while his poems have that Zen quality to them that we would normally associate with Zen poetry, these insights, these pithy pieces of wisdom, they, at the same time, they deconstruct that. And I think that's where his Dadaist and sometimes Surrealist aspects come into play in the poems. They really complicate a Zen understanding. I think they enrich that, but they certainly approach a Zen understanding from an entirely different perspective, and that's the Dadaist perspective. Now, along this line, I want to mention a book about Takahashi that I'm not going to be reading from, but this is a critical book, Buddhist Elements in Dada, a comparison of Tristan Tzara, Takahashi Shinkichi, and their fellow poets. This is by Ko Wan. It's a marvelous, marvelous critical study, analysis of Takahashi Shinkichi. And also this book does purport an interesting alliance between Dadaism and Zen. So I think that Takahashi's Zen really does become complicated by his Dadaist sensibility. I'm going to be reading primarily this evening from his book Triumph of the Sparrow, which is translated by Lucian Strike, who's really responsible for bringing Takahashi's work to the general public. I love this book, and I love this particular book. I have different versions of the poems of Takahashi. This book I looked for many years, and it was one of the few books I took with me to India when I was in India in 1994. That's how much I value this book. And it has very special memories for me then, and that's why I want to read from it, from this particular text. I want to begin with my very favorite Takahashi poem, which is entitled Burning Oneself to Death. This is about the monks that self-immolated during the Vietnam War. And yes, I am drinking a cup of tea. This is a gorgeous cup of Cloud Mist Supreme tea. Unfortunately, it's not Japanese tea tonight. I should have brewed a pot of Japanese. This is a marvelous early spring tea from China, Cloud Mist Supreme. Burning oneself to death. That was the best moment of the monk's life. Firm on a pile of firewood, with nothing more to say, hear, see. Smoke wrapped him, his folded hands blazed. There was nothing more to do, the end of everything. He remembered as a cool breeze streamed through him that one is always in the same place and that there is no time. Suddenly, a whirling mushroom cloud rose before his singed eyes, and he was a mass of flame. Globes, one after another, rolled out. The delighted sparrows flew round like fireballs. He has such wonderful sparrow imagery throughout Triumph of the Sparrow, and he is quoted to have said at one point that the sparrow was the mightiest creature in the world. I love that, again, that sensibility that something so small and delicate can have such strength. Destruction. The universe is forever falling apart. No need to push the button. It collapses at a finger's touch. Why? It barely hangs on the tail of a sparrow's eye. The universe is so much eye secretion. Hordes leap from the tips of your nostril hairs. Lift your right hand. It's in your palm. There is room enough on the sparrow's eyelash for the whole. A paltry thing, the universe. Here is all strength. Here the greatest strength. You and the sparrow are one. And should he wish, he can crush you. The universe trembles before him. Disclosure. The sparrow sleeps, thinking of nothing. Meanwhile, the universe has shrunk to half. He's attached by a navel string, swimming in a sea of fluid, amniotic, slightly bitter. The center is severance, no sound at all, until the navel string is snapped. All of which was told by her as she sat astride Pegasus, the poet on a circuit of the universe. The sparrow came at her, bill like a sword, and suddenly from her buttocks the sun. The sparrow carried the stained sheets to the moon. On drawing the clouds apart, he discovered the cold corpse of Mars. Not once had he disclosed the secrets of his life. That's such a weird little poem. It's just the associative leaps. See, the other thing that I really adore about Takahashi is that there's humor in these poems, and that's that Dada quality coming in, so that he doesn't fall into the stereotypical monolithic rendering of what a Zen poet is. And that humor is just absolutely revivifying to me. A richer ground. The bus roars through cherry blossoms or a snowstorm. Who knows? I'm not on it, but then again, I'm not on it. Who knows? Seals glide across an iceberg. Where bound? Who knows? Of course, I may be quite wrong, which in any case is unavoidable. The question, to be or not to be, just isn't fair. I stand on richer ground. I'm thinking also of a poem of his that is not in this particular book, but is in Modern Japanese Poets and the Nature of Literature by Makoto Ueda. And this is a one-line poem that I think is one of the most magnificent poems about death that I've ever encountered. And it goes this way. The title is Death. Nobody has ever died. That's the poem. That's the entire poem. Death. Nobody has ever died. And that is, I think, typical of what we would perhaps associate with a Zen poet. that paradoxical koan-like quality. Not so much Dada in that particular poem. It's still an amazing poem nonetheless. And I'd like to close this evening with a poem appropriately entitled Sparrow. Bootsy loves Takahashi. She's just taking a little nap here. Aren't you, kiddo? Everybody see you okay? Yeah? Okay. It's my sweet little beagle hound. Okay, so I'm going to close with Sparrow. This is a wild, surrealist rendering of the sparrow. And it goes this way. The sparrow, while shaving, cuts off his head, which is precisely what he wants. Thin hairs float in the pond. The sparrow has no fear of death, is indifferent to the grass sprouting on the roof, the footsteps below. Yet he leaps mightily in that dream which spreads his wings like the eagle's. Really, what pleases most is that he may survive the rape blossoms. The sparrow's head is empty, marvelously, and once dead, there'll be no further need to chatter, and twist his head about. The sparrow struggles at the noble task of mixing time, makes a mess of something he'd have ended. So that's a brief sampling of the poems of the great Japanese Dadaist Zen poet Takahashi Shinkichi. A poet who is so well respected and regarded, but not as well known as he should be. And I hope that you seek out his work. I read from Triumph of the Sparrow, translated by Lucian Strike. It's a wonderful book just to keep around on an end table, on a coffee table, at your bedside, and to pick up and just glean pieces of its wisdom. Thank you so much for joining us.